Rainbow magic. Saffron the yellow fairy. A very fierce bee. Over here, Kirsty, called Rachel Walker. Kirsty ran down one of the emerald green fields that covered this part of Rainspell Island. Buttercups and daisies dotted the grass. Don't go too far, Kirsty's mom called. She and Kirsty's dad were climbing over a stile at the top of the field. Kirsty caught up with her friend. What have you found, Rachel? Is it another rainbow fairy? She asked hopefully. I don't know. Rachel was standing on the bank of a rippling stream. I thought I heard something. Kirsty's face lit up. Maybe there's a fairy in the stream? Rachel nodded. She knelt down on the soft grass and put her ear close to the water. Kirsty crouched down too, and listened really hard. The sun glittered on the water as it splashed over big, shiny pebbles. Tiny rainbows flashed and sparkled red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And then they heard a tiny bubbling voice. Follow me. It gurgled. Follow me. Oh! Rachel gasped. Did you hear that? Yes, said Kirsty, her eyes wide. It must be a magic stream. Rachel felt her heart beat fast. Maybe the stream will lead us to the yellow fairy, she said. Rachel and Kirsty had a special secret. They had promised the king and queen of fairyland they would find the lost rainbow fairies. Jack Frost's spell had hidden the rainbow fairies on Rainspell Island. Fairyland would be cold and gray until all 7 fairies had been found and returned to their home. Silver fish darted in and out of the bright green weed at the bottom of the stream. Follow us, they whispered in tinkling voices. Rachel and Kirsty smiled at each other. Titania, the fairy queen, had said that the magic would find them. Kirsty's parents had stopped to admire the stream too. Which way now? Asked Mr. Tate. You two seem to know where you're going. Let's go this way, Kirsty said, pointing along the bank. A brilliant blue kingfisher flew up from its perch on a twig. Butterflies as bright as jewels fluttered amongst the reeds. Everything on Rainspell Island is so beautiful, said Kirsty's mom. I'm glad we still have 5 days of holiday left. Yes, Rachel thought, and 5 rainbow fairies still to find: Saffron, Fern, Sky, Izzy, and Heather. Ruby the red fairy and Amber the orange fairy were already safe in the pot at the end of the rainbow. The girls ran on ahead of Mr. and Mrs. Tate. As they followed the bubbling stream, the sun went behind a big, dark cloud. A chilly breeze ruffled Kirsty's hair. She saw that some of the leaves on the trees were turning brown, even though it wasn't autumn. It looks like Jack Frost's goblins are still around, she warned Rachel. I know. Rachel gave a shiver. Horrible things. They'll do anything to stop the rainbow fairies getting back to fairyland. The 2 friends stared anxiously up at the sky. But then the sun came out again. They smiled with relief. The stream ran through a meadow covered with green clover. A herd of black and white cows were grazing at the water's edge. They looked up with their huge, brown eyes. Aren't they lovely? Kirsty said. Suddenly the cows tossed their heads and ran off towards the other end of the field. Rachel and Kirsty looked at each other in surprise. What was going on? There was a loud buzzing noise. A small angry shape came whizzing through the air, straight towards them. Rachel almost jumped out of her skin. It's a bee, she gasped. Run! Kirsty cried. The cows had got the right idea. Rachel tore through the meadow with Kirsty beside her, their feet pounding the grass. Keep running, girls, called Mr. Tate, catching up with them. That bee seems to be following us. Rachel glanced back. The bee was huge, bigger than any bee she'd ever seen. In here, quick! Mrs. Tate called from the side of the field. She pulled open a wooden gate. They all ran through it, then stopped to get their breath. I wonder who lives here. Kirsty panted. They were in a beautiful garden. A path led up to a thatched cottage with yellow roses around the door. Just then, a very strange creature came out from behind some trees. It looked like an alien from outer space. Oh! Rachel and Kirsty gasped. The creature lifted its gloved hands and removed its white helmet to reveal an old lady. She smiled at them. Sorry if I startled you, she said. I do look a bit strange in my beekeeper's suit. Rachel sighed in relief. It wasn't a space alien after all. I'm Mrs. Mary, the old lady went on. Hello, Rachel said. I'm Rachel. This is my friend, Kirsty. And this is my mom and dad, Kirsty added. Mr. and Mrs. Tate greeted Mrs. Mary. Then Mr. Tate ducked as the huge bee zoomed past his ear. Watch out, he said. Oh, it's that hiveless queen again, said Mrs. Mary. She flapped her hand at the bee. Go on, shoo! Rachel watched it swoop over a low hedge and disappear. Why did the bee chase us? Kirsty asked. I don't think she was chasing you, my dear, said Mrs. Mary. She was just heading this way because she's looking for a hive of her own. But all of mine already have queens. Well, thank goodness she's gone now, said Mrs. Tate. Since you're here, would you like to try some of my honey? Mrs. Mary asked. Her blue eyes sparkled merrily. Oh, yes please, said Rachel. The others nodded, and they followed Mrs. Mary across the lawn to a table covered with rows of jars. Each jar was filled with rich golden honey. Dappled sunlight danced over the jars, making the honey glow. Here you are, said Mrs. Mary, spooning some honey onto a pretty, yellow plate. Thank you, Rachel said politely. She dipped her finger into the little pool of honey and popped it into her mouth. The honey was the most delicious she had ever tasted, sweet and smooth. Then she felt it begin to tingle on her tongue. She looked across at Kirsty. It tastes all fizzy, she whispered. Kirsty dipped her finger into the honey too. And look, she said. Rachel saw that the honey was sparkling with 1,000 tiny, gold lights. She grabbed Kirsty's arm. Do you think this means yes, said Kirsty. Her eyes were shining. Another rainbow fairy must be nearby. The magic hive. We have to find out where this honey came from. Rachel said excitedly. Yes, Kirsty agreed. Mom? Can we stay here a bit longer, please? As long as it's okay with Mrs. Mary, Kirsty's mom replied. Mrs. Mary beamed. Of course they can stay, she said kindly. Mr. and Mrs. Tate decided to carry on with their walk. Make sure you come back to Dolphin Cottage by lunchtime, Kirsty's mom said. We will, Kirsty promised. Come along then, girls. Mrs. Mary set off across the smooth, green lawn. Rachel and Kirsty followed her down the garden to some old and twisted apple trees. 6 wooden hives stood underneath. Kirsty stared at the row of hives. "Which one did the honey we tasted come from?" she asked. Mrs. Mary looked pleased. "Did you enjoy it? The honey from that hive tastes especially good at the moment." Rachel and Kirsty grinned at each other. "I think we might know why," Rachel whispered to Kirsty. "Yes," Kirsty agreed. "It could be fairy honey." "That's the one," Mrs. Mary said proudly, pointing to the very bottom of the garden. One hive stood there all alone, beneath the biggest apple tree. As they drew nearer to the hive, a sleepy buzzing sound drifted up into the air. "The bees in this hive are very peaceful nowadays," said Mrs. Mary. "I've never known them to be so happy." "Can we get a bit closer?" Rachel asked eagerly. She couldn't wait to find out if the hive held a magical secret. Mrs. Mary looked thoughtful. "I think it's safe, with the bees so quiet," she decided. "But you had better wear a hood like mine, just in case." She went into a nearby shed and brought out 2 beekeepers' hoods. "Here you are." Rachel and Kirsty pulled the hoods over their heads. It was a bit dark and stuffy inside, but they could see out of the fine netting. They moved closer to the hive. The soft buzzing sounded almost like music. "We need to open it and have a look," Kirsty whispered to Rachel. Rachel nodded. But they couldn't start searching for the yellow fairy with Mrs. Mary there. Ruby had warned them that no grown-ups should see the fairies. Suddenly Kirsty had an idea. "Mrs. Mary, could I have a drink of water, please?" she asked. "Of course you can, dear," Mrs. Mary said. She went off towards the cottage. The girls waited until Mrs. Mary disappeared inside. "Quick!" Kirsty spun round. "Let's open the hive." Rachel grasped one end of the lid. Kirsty took hold of the other end. They pulled hard and it slowly came loose with a squeaky sound. Strings of golden honey stretched down from the lid. "Watch out. It's very sticky," Rachel said. The girls bent down and laid the heavy wooden top carefully on the ground. Kirsty wiped her fingers on the grass. "Look!" Rachel whispered as she stood up. Kirsty turned to see, and gasped. A shower of sparkling gold dust shot up out of the hive. It hung in a soft cloud, shimmering and dancing in the sunlight. "Fairy dust!" Rachel leaned over and peered down into the hive. A tiny girl was sitting cross-legged on a piece of honeycomb in the middle of a golden sea of honey. A bee lay with its head in her lap while she combed its silky hair. Several other bees were waiting their turn, buzzing gently. "Oh, Kirsty," Rachel whispered. "We've found another rainbow fairy." Be friends. Rachel and Kirsty took off their hoods and stared down into the hive in delight. The fairy had bright yellow hair. She wore a necklace of golden raindrops around her neck and sparkly golden bracelets on both wrists. Her bright yellow t-shirt and shorts were the color of buttercups. Her delicate wings glistened with 1,000 shimmering rainbows. "Oh, thank you for finding me," the fairy said in a tinkling voice. "I'm Saffron the yellow fairy." "I'm Rachel," said Rachel. "And I'm Kirsty," said Kirsty. "We've met 2 of your sisters already, Ruby and Amber." Saffron beamed happily. "You've found Ruby and Amber?" She stood up, gently pushing the bee away. "Yes. They're safe in the pot at the end of the rainbow, Rachel said. Saffron clapped her tiny hands. I can't wait to see them again. Suddenly she looked worried. Have you seen any of Jack Frost's goblins near here? She asked. No, not here, Kirsty said. But there were some by the pot yesterday. We hid in a bush until they went away, Rachel explained. Goblins are scary, Saffron said in a trembling voice. I've been safe from them here in the hive, with my friends the bees. Rachel felt very sorry for Saffron. It's all right. King Oberon sent one of his frog footmen to look after you and your sisters. Saffron cheered up. I've been really worried about finding my sisters. Jack Frost's magic is so cold and strong. It won't be long now, Kirsty said. We are going to find Fern, Sky, Izzy, and Heather too, aren't we, Rachel? Yes. We promised, Rachel agreed. Oh, thank you, Saffron said. She threw out her arms and gave a shake of her sparkling wings. Fairy dust rose into the air and drifted down around Rachel and Kirsty. Where it landed, bright yellow butterflies appeared, with tiny fluttering wings. A large bee crawled from one of the waxy openings in the honeycomb next to Saffron. This is my best friend, Queenie, said Saffron. She put her arms round the bee's neck and kissed the top of her furry head. Queenie buzzed softly. She